City fans started to sing Blue Moon. And I remember the first time I heard that being sung, it was at Anfield on the first ever 89-90 season. We were all kept in after the game in the away section. And there's a couple of lads who just started singing it in sort of like a melancholic sort of way, and just started singing it. And then the next game, a few more. And it just started. It became the anthem that year.
Wow.
I've interviewed and met every single chairman of Manchester City going back to, they weren't always chairman when I met them, but going back to the start of the 70s, every single one of them. Eric Alexander was the sort of first one, Peter Swales and John Wardle and all these other people. Not one of them had ever asked that question. So I'm sat here and I've been hearing that, these guys from Abu Dhabi don't care, are not interested. It's a toy, it's, all this sort of stuff. And I'm thinking, well, he's asked that question. He is interested in history.
So Gary James, welcome. I want to begin by starting at the very early stages of your journey. How did history become a passion for you?
Ooh, right. Well, I've always been interested in football, right? And so I suppose the first history part of that was that I wanted to find out more about my club. So my club is Manchester City, but my family was sort of half red, half blue. My granddad was a passionate United fan, went to all their cup finals and all this sort of stuff. And my dad's passionate City fan. So it ended up that I wanted to find out more about my club. And I remember how I got into sort of writing, I guess. I started to buy football books, get me a history of football. And I was also interested in the history of Manchester and general wider history. But I remember going into like bookshops and looking for books on Manchester City. And back then, there were books on United, Everton, Liverpool, Leeds. Couldn't find anything on City. And it used to sort of drive me mad there. But one of the things, so I was interested in history and I was thinking, well, maybe one day I should write a book on City history. Never really thinking I would do. And I got in touch with his publisher. I read it. There's a book on Bradford Park Avenue that was a team that, to me, didn't exist anymore. It'd been in the Football League for years. And then in the early 70s, it had gone bust, kicked out of the league, ceased to exist, really. It was sort of resurrected, but it certainly wasn't in the league. And this book came out in the 1980s when I was a teenager. And it said, it was a history of Bradford Park Avenue. And I got this book and I was reading, I was thinking, if somebody can write a book on a team that doesn't even exist now, why aren't we doing books on City? And so I actually wrote a cheeky letter, typical letter, handwritten letter, sent off to this publisher, basically saying, enjoy your book on Bradford Park Avenue, but why don't you do a book on Manchester City? Mm-hmm. And then, bizarrely, I got a phone call from a guy who works at the publisher. So he said, we're actually doing a book on Manchester United. It's a sort of photographic history, pictorial history of the club. And we do want to do like a sister book on Manchester City, but we need to find somebody who's got knowledge of City in a particular way and perhaps got a collection of stuff, which I did have. And they said, would you be interested in helping us? So I went, yeah, why not? I met up with them and we talked about it. And the idea was this other guy was going to basically produce a book and I was just going to supply some material and help with certain information and so on. I remember I told my mum and my dad, and my mum went, you write a book? You can't do that. And that was the general reaction. And it was tough at first, but the book, it ended up, we were doing this book and it was all going well. And then unfortunately, Keith Mellor, the guy who was the main figure behind it, if you like, he died. He got cancer and he died. Oh. It was all shocking. It happened within weeks. And I just assumed that's it. I'm not going to get to write this book. And to be frank, I didn't really think anything more than that. I just thought it was a chance and that was it. And then I got a phone call off his widow and she basically told me that not his dying wish, but one of Keith's last words, if you like, was make sure Gary finishes that book. He can do it. And at that time, I was 19 when I started to do the book, but by that time I was about 20. And the publisher said, yeah, you can do it. And it ended up that I did finish it. Yeah. And it came out when I was 21 by the time it came out. wasn't a great book. It was awful, really. You know, there's lots of, I was going to say lots of errors. There's lots of, it just didn't look right. It just wasn't great. And it was a pictorial book. There wasn't a lot of writing in there, but it was a pictorial book. But once the published one, I wanted to do another and another and another. And alongside that, I was working full time eventually. You know, I was working full time, and I was doing the writing. And then eventually I thought I needed to do a PhD basically, but return to sort of academia in some ways as well, and research in detail some of the history of the really early history of sport in Manchester and beyond.
Yeah. So just on that then, so how do you develop information? How do you get information? You mentioned you had a collection. But also, you know, figuring out what's right and wrong. What kind of things do you do?
Well, back then, and to be honest, I'm doing the same sort of thing now, because I'm researching about a team called Manchester Corinthians, which is a women's football team that started in 1949, 75 years ago actually, in January 1949. And because there's an awful lot of material has been digitised, right? Loads of material has been digitised. However, back in the 80s, nothing had been digitised, obviously. So to research, you needed to get hold of match programmes, newspapers, whatever. But quite often you had to go to the original sort of newspapers, which sometimes didn't survive, or microfilm of newspapers. So basically, from, I don't know when, maybe the 1940s or something, they started to microfilm. So basically take an image of every page of certain newspapers in the same ways that you would digitise it now, but it's photographed. And then those will be in a sort of a reel, like negatives, if you like. You go to Manchester Library, you put this on a machine, and hand cranking it, you see each page of that newspaper, right? No search facilities, no, keyword, nothing. It's just photographs of newspaper pages. And so in the 80s, I mean, I thought this was fantastic in 1987 when I was doing this research. I thought it was fantastic because we talk about a newspaper from, say, the 1890s that I can see an image of, right? But now, with the technology we have today, obviously this in itself is laborious. So I spent almost every night, every week, and sometimes a full day in Manchester Central Library looking at these microfilms of newspapers. There's a newspaper called The Athletic News, which existed in the 1890s up to about 1920. There's one called The Umpire, The Sporting Chronicle, all these sort of newspapers, as well as the Manchester Evening News, the Daily Express, whatever, but going through them, desperately searching for material. Now, with football teams like Manchester City, Manchester United, obviously we know when games were played because we've got fixture lists or whatever, or we can find them, or match programmes. But sometimes the real stories would be on a Wednesday in the close season. So it was very much looking for a needle in a haystack. If you're trying to track somebody's playing career, you've got no hope, really. And I'm sort of doing this again at the moment with the Manchester Corinthians, because this team, it was a women's football team, and they got some coverage in some local newspapers. But typically, the newspapers that they appeared in have not been digitised. So in Manchester, yes, we all know about Manchester Evening News, great newspaper, and a lot of that's been digitised. Not all, but a lot of it has. But the Evening News was not the sports paper. It would carry some football information, but it didn't really specialise in that. It had a different, it covered it to some extent, but it didn't really focus on that. There was another evening newspaper called the Manchester Evening Chronicle, and that was much more sports-minded, but that's never been digitised. So you go back to the original microfilm and back, and I've been doing that, and only just before Christmas, the week leading up to Christmas, I was in Manchester Library, a few days, 1 week, desperately searching through 1949 editions of the Manchester Evening Chronicle, looking for a mention of the Manchester Corinthians. And one day I found 2 mentions and was delighted because I'd found something that you can't find. And also the sports newspapers. Manchester used to have a Saturday night, a couple of Saturday night sports papers. It had one called The Pink, which survived into the 2000s, and one called The Green, which went in the 60s. Neither of those have really been archived. Neither of them have really survived. there may be odd issues around in newspaper archives, but they didn't even get microfilmed. So we're talking about looking for the original newspaper, and it may or may not exist. So it's, a lot of frustration at times, but when you find that little nugget, it's absolutely incredible. And a lot of people, today will say, oh, I've done research and I found, I've done my research on the Daily Mail newspaper, which is digitised, for example, right? As an example, I've got a newspaper cutting from 1982 from the Daily Mail about the Manchester Creamfield. So it's a nice cutting. It involves Matt Busby, the Manchester United manager, and it's a bit of a feature. And I've got the actual newspaper, which somebody let me borrow the cutting of. The digitised version of the Daily Mail does not have this article there. It has another article because the newspapers that have been digitised tend to be the London versions, and Manchester always had its own version of the Daily Mail. So even when a newspaper has been digitised, a lot of the stuff that a local historian or a football historian wants about Manchester or the North or Scotland or wherever else, it just isn't there because it's the London edition that's digitised. Wow. And I can prove it by showing, side by side, the bit that's the paper that's been digitised, that page, the adverts there, there's like, I don't know what, but an advert for a car, say, on that page, and the article surrounds it, and then in the Manchester version, it's an article that I'm interested in. So it's frustrating, but when you find something, it's fantastic.
Yeah. So for those that are listening and watching that might be interested in the history of Manchester City, can you maybe summarise how Manchester City was formed and how that come about as a football club?
Yeah, I mean, the roots of both Manchester clubs actually go back to East Manchester, go back to the Gorton, Ardwick, Clayton, Newton Heath sort of side of Manchester. So if you think at the moment, nowadays there's that sort of ring road, Alan Turing Way, that sort of skirts round that area. And that part of Manchester was very much working class, lots of factories, coal mines as well. The site of City's current stadium was a coal mine going back. Iron works, lots of railway works, lots of heavy industry, and working class people, terraced houses, Coronation Street style houses, that sort of thing. And in those communities, football became something anyone could do, really. You could wrap a load of newspapers up and use it as a football. So you could play on the streets and you could do that. And football, to me, has always been the simplest of games. If you play cricket, you need wickets or a ball, and okay, you can paint them, but you need maybe equipment, you need a bat, whatever. Football, very, very simple. Yes, you might need a football, but you could make a football if you needed to. That's it. And Manchester sort of lagged behind the rest of Northern England in terms of football. So Sheffield had a strong football community, Nottingham did, Scotland absolutely did, but Manchester was sort of struggling. Now, in my research, I found a club that existed in 1863 in Manchester called Athenaeum, which were based in Newham actually, but that was a sort of like a sports club, a sort of leisure club that was created for men to try and give them to educate them in some ways because it had a library, but also to try and give them sort of a physical outlet. A bit like, I was going to say a leisure centre. It would never have been that grand, but that sort of idea of somewhere to go to and improve. And that club had lasted about 8 years, but because it was at the 1860s, there wasn't really any competition in Manchester. We had to go to Sheffield to play. Then the 1870s, other clubs started to appear. There's a club called Manchester Association Football Club, which had sort of come out of Athenaeum. There was some roots, some of the people who played for this club and come out of that. But it still wasn't right. And then East Manchester, as you get in mid to late 1870s, football's starting to develop. But it's very much, Newton Heath was a railway workers in 1878. They created a sports club, which eventually led to football. And in Gorton, West Gorton in Manchester, a church called St Mark's Church, the boys who played cricket from that church then established a football club. And gradually both Newton Heath and St Mark's sort of grew and moved grounds. They started to develop, and in 1892, both clubs, by that time it was Newton Heath United, Ardwick, which was City, both clubs joined the league in 1892, but failed. They struggled. And in 1894, the team that Ardwick, the team that basically Manchester City, was close to collapse, finishing bottom of it. Was the league was 2 divisions, finishing near the bottom of the second division. And as that last season of 1893-4 was taking place, a group of supporters decided to create a new club. There's a guy, he was called Joshua Palby, and he was this great big. He played football in Stoke, but he was quite a sort of forceful character, a confident sort of character. He was likened to Falstaff from the Shakespeare. He was a big sort of Brian Blessed type of thing, somebody who walks into a room and everybody hears him and sees him and so on. And Joshua Palby was the secretary manager of Ardwick. But whilst he's the secretary manager of Ardwick, he's sort of saying, I think we need a different team. I think we need a team to represent Manchester. I think we need to create a Manchester team. And he ends up, other people actually created a team, but he became the voice and the face of this new football club, Manchester City. So you still had Newton Heath, but then you had in 1894 Manchester City. And they applied to join the league. So Ardwick was seen as a different club. Ultimately, the two teams were basically the same, but it was seen as a different club. And Joshua Palby did this speech at the league AGM to say that this football club that he'd created, this Manchester City Football Club, was going to, Manchester needed a strong football team. Sort of ignoring the fact that Newton Heath existed, because Newton Heath had failed, ignoring the fact that Ardwick had existed. He was basically saying, Manchester, this leading, this world industrial city, this global power, if you like, this magnificent city, this city needed a strong football club. And the league would benefit by having this team in it. And Manchester City got elected into the Football League. The day they got elected, they did not have a football ground. They did not have any players. They had a few directors because they had to buy share in it, but that was it. But he told the league that they had a ground, that they had players, that they had everything else. And then for the next few weeks, that was May 1894, but for the next few weeks, he managed to get players, he managed to get a ground. They did sort of take a lot of the Ardwick stuff. And then September 1894, they're playing in the second division. And then within 5 years, they become the first Manchester team to get promoted, which they did in 1899. They won the second division title. And then another 5 years after that, they won the FA Cup and the runners-up in the league. So this vision that he had in 1894 was paid off within 10 years. It had gone from basically nothing to being a dominant, powerful force.
How does it come about in terms of changing names and kit colours? Because obviously you mentioned Newton Heath.
Yeah.
And obviously I think St Mark's was black originally. Well, and then obviously the colour changes on kits with the yellow and green.
None of us know for certain what kit St Mark's wore in their first couple of years. What we do know is that in 1884, they changed the name to Gorton, and they were playing on at the Bull's Head Hotel on Reddish Lane. But by that time, they were wearing a white cross, which was called a cross pate. People often say it was a Maltese cross, but it's not. It's a cross pate, which the reasoning behind that is not clear. There's lots of theories, but nobody knows a definitive answer. It probably means that it's a connection with the sort of church roots, but it could also be a link to the local Masonic community, because there were links with the Masonic community at that time. But other football teams were wearing shirts with crosses like that, so there'd be many reasons. But that was a black shirt. We don't know how long they wore that for. That could just have been one season. It could even have been one game, but we do know they wore that for a couple of years. When they became Ardwick, they initially wore royal blue and white stripes, and then they changed to a pale blue and white. They called them quarters, but it was sort of like half, and same at the back, really. One panel blue, one panel white. When they became Manchester City in 1894, it was the same sort of pale blue. For Newton Heath, Now, this is fascinating for me, but in that a lot's been made of green and gold. There's no evidence that they actually wore green and gold at the start. In fact, all the evidence points to wearing red and white at the start.
Right.
I, as part of my research, there's a football newspaper from a Saturday night football newspaper that existed in the 1920s in Manchester, and all that exists in that newspaper are the physical copies at the British Library. And I went to do some research about something else, right? But I'd sort of ordered these volumes. So basically, I'm sat there at the British Library. I had a problem that day. I had transport problems. I had all sorts of issues. And I got there around about 1 hour before the place closed to get these bound volumes, which had to be ordered in advance. And they get brought up. And so these volumes are here. And there was 6 of them, because I think that was the limit I was allowed to order in a day. But 6 of them. And they were from 1917 to 1922 or 23, something like that. And I was there, as I say, to do something else. I was not researching United or City. I was doing some other general football research. And when these binders were brought to me, the guy who brought them, the librarian, said to me, this one here, and was one of the bound newspaper volumes, and it was wrapped in sort of cellophane. It was all sort of protected. He said, I don't think I'm going to let you look at this. I think it's in too bad a condition for you to look at it, because it's the only copy we've got, and as you can see, it's damaged. But let me take this cellophane off and have a look. And I said, I've come all the way down for this. I've only got an hour. I could really want to let me look at it, basically. And eventually he looked at it and he said, right, I'm going to let you do your research on this today, but this may be the last time we bring it out of the archive. So I'm thinking, right, I need to get as much material on this as I can. Yeah. So I'm going through this, and it's parts of it are crumbling, and it's not in a good state. Because if you think about it, a newspaper that's over 100 years old, and it's fragile for a start, but also it's clearly not. It's been looked after to some extent, but it's damaged. And I'm going through it, and then all of a sudden I see this series of articles. Well, one week it says familiar faces, and it told the story of one of the local football clubs. It wasn't City United, I think it was Ashton United, actually, by interviewing a guy who was there when the club was created. So we talk about a club that was created in the 1870s. So I've done a PhD on the origins of football in Manchester. This is interesting to me, so I take a picture of that page, read it, obviously take a picture. I'm thinking, I wonder if this is a regular series. And I'm going through, and then the following week there's another one, and it's about a rugby club. So okay, not quite the same, but still of interest. I'll take that. And then all of a sudden I spot one about Newton Heath, and it was a guy, his surname was Dale, Herbert Dale I think it was, who claimed to be there when Newton Heath first played football. And I'm reading it, and I've took some images of it. I'm reading it, and he says he's talking about Newton Heath playing football, and he says the person who founded the club as a football team. Because the thing about Newton Heath, which always gets confused, about Manchester United, always gets confused. People just say, "Oh, they were created in 1878." Well, they were, but there's no evidence of them playing football until 1880, right? And a bit like St Mark's Church, they were playing cricket in the 1860s. It'd be foolish for me to say, "Oh, they were Manchester City was founded in 1865," because it's playing cricket. It's not the same thing. So I'm looking at this, and he talks about this guy who founded the club, Sam Black, or came up with the idea of football. And when you know the age of Sam Black, you know that he was perhaps in 1878, he was perhaps too young to have, would have been about 15, I think it was. But in 1880, he was 17, probably more likely to be listened to. I think he was 17. The age doesn't matter, but, it was that difference. Not only that, this article talks about the colours, red and white. Talks about where the football came from, who got the ball, who bought the ball to play. And all of it fits with Newton Heath playing in red and white from 1880. The earliest match report we can find is 1880 against Bolton Wanderers' second team. So they may have played in, sort of internal games, just like you might have a kickabout on the street. They may have done that, but the first proper game that we can find is 1880. Coincidentally, so is the St Mark's game. Their earliest one is 1880. But there were other clubs in Manchester at the time, before 1880. So if the team had been actually playing football from 1878, they would have probably played one of these other teams where we've got match reports for. So anyway, this article that I found sort of gave information that backed up a lot of the stuff that some of us have sort of believed for years but never had the evidence for. And it backs it all up. And I was so close not to gain it because it was in this binder that was going to be locked away forevermore. So yeah, and later on I've found a similar sort of piece with St Mark's, which talked about the first pitch they played on, which confirmed something that I'd suspected in the 90s when I was doing some research. But here in black and white was this guy, Walter Chew, who was involved with the club at the beginning, saying who founded the club and which pitch he played on. So,
is there anything that has changed your perception on the way that you view sport or view football from your research? Is there anything that you found has actually really changed your outlook towards certain things that might have surprised you or maybe educated you in a way that has,
I think there's
challenged that or
a
defined
few
that?
things. I mean, as an academic, one of the things that frustrates me still today is that, in general, historians do not appreciate what sport gives us, what football in particular gives us. And when I started doing my PhD, which was 10 years ago, well, more than 10 years ago now, but when I started doing my PhD, I'd be at conferences, history conferences, where serious historians would be basically saying football's trivial. And some of these same people would be perhaps writing the history of a factory. Now, that is important. I'm not saying that's not important, but in Manchester, from the late 1890s, you were getting at least 20,000 people every week at either City or United. Then you've got Stockport, Bury, but you've got loads of clubs around the area, for example, over the years that attracted crowds. Nowadays, it's 50-odd thousand at City, 70-odd thousand at United. That's not insignificant. That the cultural significance of that is huge, And if you think about sport of any kind, can be hugely motivational, can be break down barriers, can encourage people who perhaps feel the world's got an issue with them or whatever, can encourage them to get involved in something, can give us pride. It can also damage, it can also do the negatives. There's lots of things about sport that can cause problems for people. But whichever way you look at it, it's hugely significant. And so for me, one of the things that got me last year was that, this is something I've been thinking about for years really, but women's football in Manchester has been hugely significant. I'm currently writing a book on the Manchester Corinthians, this women's team that was established 75 years ago. Last year, a couple of years back, I started a campaign to get a blue plaque put up for the Manchester Corinthians. And we succeeded in the end. We raised money and we did it. And we managed to get Andy Burnham to come along, as well as people from the FA and others. And it ended up on News at 10 even. So it was, I was quite pleased with that. But Manchester is such a diverse city, such an important city, and yet women's football was sort of not recognised as being of significance to this city from 75 years ago, right? This team, the Manchester Corinthians, in the 1950s, went to Germany and won a major European trophy, playing against European teams. In 1960, they went to South America and won. It wasn't a World Cup, but it was a sort of international tournament of that sort of status, playing in Venezuela. Neither City nor United had won any European trophy or played in South America at this point. And there's a women's team going off doing that, playing in front of crowds of 60,000. And Manchester didn't know enough. So I think even now, there's still this feeling that as great And as important as football is to Manchester, I don't think historians properly recognise what football has given to Manchester. And the same in Birmingham, the same in London, the same elsewhere. We'll talk about the major successes. We'll talk about the disaster, Munich air disaster, for example. We'll talk about those things. But we won't talk about the day-to-day life and what football and sport in general means to people, and how it improves the city, and how it develops the city, and how it gives us something else. So I suppose that, when I first started researching around about football, it was about who won last week. Who's a great goal scorer. What? Yeah. It's not really about goal scorers. It's not really about last night's game. What it's about is 50,000 people coming together, 70,000 people coming together, witnessing a moment, witnessing something that you just can't buy. If you're a United fan, you'll think about the 1999, the treble, the European Cup final, that last gasp winner, and all that, all that sort of thing. If you're a City fan, you'll talk about Aguero and that dramatic moment. And these are moments, whether it's Sheringham, whether it's Aguero, whether these are moments that then live on for decades and decades when you've experienced it. I'll think about being there with my youngest daughter when Aguero scored. And I'll think about how 5 minutes before that she's convinced we can pull it back and still win the league. And I'm saying to her, you've not been watching City as long as that. You don't know. City will never come back. And then City come back and she's right, But there's so many people where football or sport in general has helped their lives or changed something. And that's significant.
Yeah. What about football chanting then? So I'm interested on how anthems become part of football clubs. Obviously, my team is Birmingham City, and the famous song is "Keep Right On." And there's other anthems, "The Invisible Man" and "Blue Moon," and all these kind of songs that are associated with football clubs. How does that emerge? How does that come about? I'm interested on that.
It is interesting, and "Keep Right On" till the end of the road. It's one of the sort of older ones, really. Birmingham City and Manchester City played each other in the 1956 Cup final. And at that time, City sang a version of "Bless 'Em All," using the names of players but during that game, Manchester City beat Birmingham City. But during that game, Bill Levers, who was one of the City defenders, I don't know which Birmingham City player he was singing it to, but every time he sort of went into a challenge with one of the Birmingham attackers or whatever, he started singing "Keep Right On" till the end of the road because Manchester City were in it. Chants. There's a long history of people singing at football matches. So going way back to the 1890s, there were songs that were sung. But typically it would have been popular songs of the day. So, the teams from Lancashire would tend to have "She's a Lassie from Lancashire," which is an old sort of music hall song. But sing that, fans would sing that. Over time, those sort of general songs started to develop. Now, "You'll Never Walk Alone" is often described as the first proper chant, and it's not. There's songs going way back. Coventry City had a song, "On the Ball City," which they still sing, which goes way back, and so have other clubs. And "You'll Never Walk Alone" wasn't necessarily sung by Liverpool fans first. Manchester United will claim they sang it first because, and I think there's truth in this, that just after the Munich air crash, there was a version of "You'll Never Walk Alone" that had been released by, I forgot who it was now, in my mind, I think it's Eddie Cochran, but it was a big sort of singer of the period, which in those days there wasn't the sort of music chart that there was in the 60s. In the 50s, there was different music charts. But anyway, this song, this version was quite popular, and United fans are absolutely adamant that in the days that followed Munich, they were singing "You'll Never Walk Alone" because it seemed appropriate because of the crash, but also it was a popular tune in that.
Right,
No. So they were singing it, and they'll claim that Liverpool fans eventually took it over. And I remember as a kid in the 70s, all teams sang that song. We all sang it. We associated it with success. So there's actually film at the North West Film Archive of Manchester City fans singing it in Albert Square when they came back with the League Cup in 1976. Scarfs up, all that, you'll never, all exactly as it's sung on the Kop. And it was normal to do that. What had changed was that Liverpool tended to have more success than anybody else. And so we all started to drop it.
Yeah.
And then by the mid-1980s, if somebody tried to sing it on the Kippax at City, everyone else would start chanting "Dirty Scouse Song," "Dirty Scouse Song," and it'd stop. And there were other versions, you'll never walk again, you'll never work again. That sort of thing started to come. But football chants like Blue Moon in the 80s. What started to happen at football clubs was that I think maybe Stoke started this with Delilah, but clubs started to latch on to more popular type songs, typical sort of songs. United started singing "You'll Always Look on the Bright Side of Life," from the Monty Python film, and City fans started to sing "Blue Moon." And I remember the first time I heard that being sung, it was at Anfield on the first of the 89-90 season, and we were all kept in after the game in the away section, and there's a couple of lads who just started singing it in sort of like a melancholic sort of way, and just started singing it. And then the next game, a few more, and it just started. It became the anthem that year. And within months, it was something that became popular, and it stayed. But it's really bizarre, because I think if you went to a football ground, and even if it was half a dozen of you, and tried to force everyone to sing a song, I don't think it would happen. I think it's more about the mood at that moment and about the way things are. In the late 70s, there's a chant that City fans sing, which is it's the Viking call. There's a film called The Vikings, and with Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis, and whenever they sort of blew the horn, if you like, the Viking horn, it would make this tune, and maybe some music that went with it. And City fans sort of adopted that in the 70s. The film had been on television, and it became adopted, and gradually it evolved into people doing City, City, City instead of a horn, and it sort of built up. Nowadays, we sing "The Best Team in the Land and all the World," and that chant started in 1976, I think it was. 76, 77, that sort of time. And I did some research on it and tracked down to this specific day when it was done, because of memories and because of where it was played, it was sung, and where the film show was shown. And it sort of, it just lasted for decades and decades and decades. And then in the last few years, an Arsenal journalist described City fans as being arrogant for singing "The Best Team in the Land and all the World." What have they won? What have they won? Not realising this chant was being sung in the mid-1970s. It's just a chant. It's a chant that's evolved and developed. Now it might be true, right? It's just a football chant, The United fans singing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life," as we did in the 80s and 90s. They were winning trophies, but that's more the, if you know the life of Brian and the scene where he starts singing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life," it's about sort of death and what's coming next. Well, United fans singing that in the 90s when we're winning all the trophies, it's crazy in a sense, but it's just what football fans do.
Yeah. It's interesting how you mentioned contemporary society and how that reflects upon songs and culture and everything that's associated with football fans. Am I right in saying "Forever Blowing Bubbles" was like a TV advert, wasn't it? And that kind of emerged into a player that was on a commercial.
Oh, it might do. Yeah, I don't know. I know quite a few West Ham fans. I'll have to ask them, but yeah, but it's interesting now. Football clubs then take it to another level, don't they? So if you watch any game at West Ham, if they score a goal, all these bubbles start coming out. I mean, Blue Moon, that's become a cultural thing at City. So it was a song, but now the Blue Moon appears at City, and with that Viking chant that I was talking about, in the 70s, the BBC were doing a thing on football crowds, and they wanted City fans to do that, because it's unique to City. It's absolutely unique to City. It's probably the only one that is truly unique to City. Because Crew, for example, sang Blue Moon before City did. But they've got the cameras there, they've got the microphones there, they got that, and they kept trying to prompt them to sing it. And of course, they didn't sing it. Now, I'm as a football historian, I'm disappointed, because it would have been great to have that recording. But also knowing what it's like to be stood at a football match, if somebody tells you to do something, you do the opposite. So I totally understand that. There's no way they were going to start singing that song because the BBC asked them. Yeah. Absolutely no.
Do the football clubs come to you in terms of informing practice then, Gary? Do you kind of work with Man City to maybe research around a certain historical point or inform practices around maybe certain landmarks that have happened in history or what?
Things that happened. I've done some stuff with Leicester City, Liverpool. When Liverpool were going to build a new stadium, I attended a few things there and did some stuff. United as well. I've done some stuff for their museum and for Munich anniversaries in the past. And City have as well. Some of this I get paid for, some of it I don't. It depends on what the project is. I suppose the best one in terms of that I've done over the last decade was connect with City, and it was the redesign of a club badge.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Tell me about this.
I don't know if you remember, but
like a falcon, the original badge, wasn't it?
It was an eagle.
Eagle. Sorry, with the 3 stars and
3 stars. Yeah. Eagle, shield, Latin motto. Right?
So what did that represent? If you don't mind me asking.
So that badge was created in the 1990s, and it was all to do with a takeover of Manchester City. I won't bore you with all of that, but basically, the club's merchandise operation was not owned by the club. Crazy, but anyway. So they decided to create a new badge. So we got rid of the old badge, create a new badge, and they wanted it to represent Manchester. Right? So the eagle is connected with a logo that was used by Manchester City Council in the 1950s. In 1957, the City Council said, we've had enough sports clubs wearing the Manchester coat of arms when we get to a major sporting final. From now on, they can use this emblem. And it was an eagle emblem. And in 1958, if you get a photograph of the Manchester United shirts in the cup final, they're actually wearing that eagle, that badge, that eagle. The part of it's not the same as the City, but the eagle is the same. So that's where that eagle comes from. It's from that 1957 Manchester City Council logo. And the eagle represents Manchester's Roman links. Now, when the badge came out in the 90s, I think it was Noel Gallagher said, you don't get many eagles flying around Manchester. So, straight away, that sort of put the knife into the badge a little bit. And the central shield was based on the Manchester coat of arms. So the ship that's always been on sort of City emblems was there. It's also always been on United emblems, the ship, although it's a different design for United, but it comes from the Manchester coat of arms. And then the bottom half of that shield was 3 sort of lines, which were said to represent the rivers of Manchester, River Irwell, the River Irk, and the River Medlock. Those are 3 rivers that go through the city centre. Not that you can see them much because they're in the way, are they? But they go through the city centre. So that's what that was supposed to represent. And then the Latin motto was completely invented in 1996 or 97, I think it was, and it meant pride in battle. So in the late 90s, 97 is the time when City were just basically falling apart and going down the divisions and, ended up in the 3rd tier. So pride in battle actually did seem appropriate to some extent, but that badge didn't really represent the club's history in the way the club wanted to. The 3 stars meant nothing at all. They were just on there for artistic, to make it look more continental to what was said at the time. And most City fans were like, why have you done that? United fans said, oh, those 3 stars represent Bell, Lee, Somerset, the only stars you've ever had. Right? They also, by the time you get into the 1999, they're saying, oh, those 3 stars, they represent the 3 divisions you were in the in the 90s. So it was always a bit of a joke, and that carried on for years. So when first of all, Taxi Shinawatra took over a club in 2007. He decided to sort of change the badge. Fortunately, that didn't happen. because he was not going to listen to what the fans wanted or anybody else. What he was going to do was create a badge that would be popular in Thailand where it's from.
Yeah.
He was going to have an elephant on it.
Wow. That could have been a disaster.
Could you imagine? I mean, people talk about owners ruining football clubs and this sort of thing. Well, this was, he was a fit and proper person. The FA were happy with him. And then suddenly, a year later, it's Sheikh Mansour, and this is bad news. Is it? Yeah.
Reminds me a bit of the Cardiff situation with the logo changing.
Exactly like that. Exactly like that, because he changed the colour of the kit. You know, red and
dragon on the crest.
And it is that, and that's so. So what happened after that? The club delayed. Once Sheikh Mansour had taken over the city, the club delayed doing any kind of badge change. But in September 2008, the takeover City sort of became public on transfer deadline day when City signed Robinho, and there was all this drama on 1st September. But then it sort of went quiet, and then 23rd of September was the official takeover day. But a couple of days before that, I got a call out of the blue asking me if I would come and meet somebody at City. And the call I got, it wasn't explained to me who this person was, but they wanted my sort of historical input into something. So I went along to the Etihad. Well, obviously it wasn't called the Etihad then, but I went to the City of Manchester Stadium, and I was waiting and waiting, and eventually Gary Cook, who was the chief executive.
He's at Birmingham now, that guy.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he's a good guy. Got a lot of bad press, but he is a good guy. Well, Gary Cook, it's really strange because he's the one who phoned me on Friday night, and Gary Cook, I've got a few stories about Gary, but I best not do all those things. But Gary Cook came sort of bouncing down the stairs. I was in reception at City. He came bouncing down the stairs like Tigger, you know, bounce. And he went, Gaz. Never called me Gaz before. Gaz. And he comes over to me, and I stand up, and he sort of puts his arm around me and starts taking me up the stairs, right? And he's really excited. And he says to me, the guy I'm going to introduce you to is Khaldun Al-Mubarak. He's going to be the new chairman. All right, okay. He's got some questions about the history of football, history of City, history of Manchester, history of football. Oh, right, okay. So I then get taken into the old boardroom. It's changed now, but into the old boardroom. And there's quite a few people in there. I'm introduced to a few people, and then I'm introduced to Khaldun, and we end up sitting down at a table like this, and he's on one sort of corner like you, and I'm on one corner. And he's got a notebook out, and he said to me, first question was, how and why was this football club created? And I've interviewed and met every single chairman of Manchester City going back to, they weren't always chairman when I met them, but going back to the start of the 70s, every single one of them. Eric Alexander was the sort of first one, Peter Swales and John Wardle and all these other people. Not one of them had ever asked that question. Now, okay, some of them may have known. I know some of them didn't know. Right? Yeah. So I'm sat here, and I've been hearing that, you know, these guys from Abu Dhabi don't care, are not interested. It's a toy, it's, you know, all this sort of stuff. And I'm thinking, well, he's asked that question. He is interested in history. So I talked to him about that. He asked about the biggest stars in the club's history. So I talked to him about Colin Bell. I talked to him about Bert Troutman. I told him Bert Troutman's story. And he turned to one of his staff who were there and said, as soon as we can we get Bert Troutman to a game to thank him for everything he's done for his football club? And I'm thinking, wow, only a year ago, Bert Troutman was being told, if you want to come to a game, you've got to buy your own ticket, more or less. You know, it was that sort of feeling. So, wow, you know, one of the biggest names in club's history. So, anyway, and then he asked me about the badge. And he asked me what every element of that badge meant. But he didn't just ask me about the eagle badge. He asked me about the earlier badges of the ship and the round badges. So we talked about that. So anyway, roll forward. And on my way home, after I'd left and he'd asked all these questions, I get in the car and I'm driving away from the stadium, and 606 was on, and I can't remember who was on 5 Live that night, but whoever it was saying, these new owners of Manchester City, they don't care about the history of this club. And I'm thinking, I've just spent however many hours with somebody asking me questions about the history of this club. So, you know, they do, right? Anyway, Move forward a few years, and I got a phone call one day from somebody saying, could I come in? And I was told the club was going to change its badge. But actually, what we were going to do was a consultation. They wanted to find out what fans wanted on the badge. They wanted this to be the most in-depth consultation that had ever occurred at a football club. They wanted fans to understand every element of the badge. They wanted to get a feeling for what fans wanted, and the club would obviously design it, but basically the fans would choose the elements that would go into that badge. And they asked me, would I be in favour of that? I said, absolutely. For me, the Eagle badge is a bit of a disaster. It links the worst ever days of the football club. But they did say, if the consultation comes back with the result that everybody wants, or the majority of people want the current badge, or a form of the current badge, then it stays. Oh, right. So what happened then was I spent quite a bit of time doing presentations to senior management at City to explain what every element of the club badge meant and what every element of the previous club badges meant, what Manchester symbols there were. So the B, for example, which had never appeared on a football emblem of City or United. Obviously the lines, the rivers, the stars, the eagle, all that. So I went through all of that with the club, explained all of that. And then I did a series of presentations to fans, right? So the club created consultation booths, they sent circulars out, they did all sorts of things like that, but they did like a display showing the history of the badges, the history of the elements, so basically taken from a lot of material that I'd given them. And then I did a series of talks about this, and fans were sat there explaining what their views were. Then when we explained the history, what the red rose stood for, what the line stood for, whatever, sometimes it changed views. And when people realise, oh, United wore the eagle in 1958, and people are going, oh, we don't want the eagle, then do it. All those sort of things happened. So it did actually become the most in-depth consultation that had ever happened. And then not long after that, Everton, was it before? Everton messed up. I think the consultation was...
I think Leeds United had a spell when they messed up.
Leeds did, yeah. Leeds did that one, like a guy's chest fist or whatever it was. Leeds completely messed up. Because, unfortunately, what tends to happen is that a football club will think, yeah, we need a modern badge, and we'll go to a designer. What we need to do is involve designers, obviously, right? But talk to fans, understand history, explain the history. Everton tried to simplify their badge because nowadays logos should be more simple, design experts will say, right? They tried to simplify it, fans objected, so then they've overcomplicated it by throwing all those old elements back onto it. So it's a bit of a mess now, their badge. Leeds had to backtrack completely. Who was it? Just another team.
Aston Villa changed. They had prepared in their logo, prepared in the badge, and they got removed.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Champions League stars a symbol within that. There's a range of clubs.
Well, the stars are a silly thing as well, because the stars, no one has to wear a star. It's up to the clubs. And no one says, put a star on your badge because you've won the European Cup. But teams have started to do that at times. And I think it's a bit odd. I mean, City still had the 3 stars on their shirt, which, as I said before, meant nothing when they won the league in 2012. And I jokingly said to somebody at City, just stick another star on to wind everybody up. Because then they'll think, why is it 4 stars? Just do it. Because it means nothing. So just put a 4th one on. Because what had happened when 2012 when City won the league, that meant City won the league 3 times in total. So the stars, somebody could say, oh, they do mean something now. But I was saying, no, mess it around. Take one off, But Villa, I think they still talk about the Villa badge, about changing it again. Because I saw there's a fan group that have started to design something.
Right.
And what they've started to design is actually a bit more of a complicated badge. And unfortunately, quite often we need to be simplified. But, Arsenal, they turned the cannon round. Their badge. And when I said Taksin Shinawatra was going to change the badge, at one point I was in a meeting and it was suggested that the ship on the City sort of badge at the time should be turned around because the ship points to the left-hand side. So people say, oh, like the Arsenal cannon, it looks backwards. So turn it around. And
Right, okay, yeah.
But that defeats the whole point of having a ship on there, because that ship was to represent trading links with America, basically. Yeah. So turn it around. It doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean.
It's complex then.
Why do that? You don't need to do that. And football, a football badge doesn't necessarily mean that the team's going backwards. You know, if you get the badge wrong, Everton and Leeds and so on, it can be a negative, or like the Cardiff situation, it can be a real negative. But if you get it right, it doesn't really matter which way around the ship points, so long as you get it right and fans are on board. And with the City badge, the new version of the City badge, the biggest thing that came out of the sort of fan association was it needed to be round, and it needed to be based on the more traditional badges that the club had. Because the round, City had from the 1930s, they'd had a round badge. It wasn't worn on football shirts until the early 70s, but from the 30s, they'd had this round badge. And so it sort of evolved over the years, but that was more appropriate. Yeah. And so that is relevant. But City still got criticism from some people saying, oh, why have you got a round badge? Well, because that's more traditional, actually. Yeah.
I always ask my guests, really on the reflection of what they've spoken about and everything they've talked about, how would they like to be remembered? So my question is geared into you yourself. How would you like to be remembered if you kind of take a step back and go, okay, I'm going to chill out and retire and spend time with the family and watch City on the weekend and relax?
The thing that I've always wanted to do from the start is ensure people remember footballers and football clubs that have made a difference. So historians are never the story, or should never be the story. Some make themselves a story. Historians shouldn't be the story. Historians are the ones who perhaps have the tools to bring somebody's story back to life, open the door maybe. So the work I'm doing at the moment for Manchester Corinthians, which nobody's paying me to do that, it's something I passionately want to do. I want to bring their story back to life. Some of the stuff I've done for Manchester City or for Manchester United, I did some years ago, I did some stuff that I thought was great about the Munich air disaster, about Manchester and how it affected Manchester, because quite often we talked about the key players. We didn't necessarily talk about their families or the families of the victims. We didn't necessarily talk about the average person on the street. We didn't talk about lots of things, the journalists and so on. So I wanted people to remember all of people involved and how it affected every Mancunian. We get tribal these days. Some City fans will talk negatively about Manchester United and Munich. Some United fans will maybe not understand how that disaster affected Manchester or Mancunians. They'll think about it from a club perspective. So what I've always wanted to do is try and say, this is how it affects us all. This is how we've all been, we're all involved in that. And so I'd like to be remembered as somebody who has tried to reveal stories and bring light to somebody else. So whether it's Margaret Whitworth, who played for Manchester Corinthians, or Joe Mercer, who managed Manchester City, when I'm writing about those people and researching their lives, I want them to be remembered, not me.
Yeah, excellent. Gary, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your insight. It's been very inspiring to hear your passion for history and your love for research and finding out new things. And as you mentioned, your values of making sure that everyone's remembered. So I just want to say thank you for taking the trip to Manchester today to talk, and good luck in the future with Manchester Corinthians and any other project that might be happening. I don't know if Manchester City are changing their badge anytime soon, but maybe a third star if the Champions League comes about in the next 10 years. But just want to say thank you and good luck.
Well, thanks for having me. And I think for me it's great to talk like this, but the passion, we all love football and we all love sport and we all want to look at how that changes lives. So thanks for having me.